an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Magician's Apprentice, chapters 23, 24, 25, 26, and that's it. In these chapters, yikes. What goes on with Stara's father and her is frankly, there's been a lot of terrible shit in these books. I mean, there's been a lot, but for some reason, this one got to me more than most of it. I don't know why, but I really want her to just kill this dude. Kill her own father. I really do want her to do that. And then run and get the fuck out. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. Many thanks to Ashleigh for commissioning this episode. I don't know if Ashleigh is here right now. Are you here, Ashleigh? These chapters are a lot. Like, there's a few things that go on. Of course, there's the Sachakans finally deciding that they... Well, not exactly deciding, because one guy sort of goes rogue, but they finally lash out and kill a Karelian, which kind of changes everything. There's the decision for the magicians to, like, change up the way that they are training their apprentices. There is the talk, finally, of maybe we should have our own guild, which is really, like... It's always funny when you think back before something was done about, like... Any governing body or any, like, system that you have taken for granted that it exists and is available, going back and thinking what it must have been like before that was there, before that existed and was available, is always a weird moment. And I appreciate so much, having read the first trilogy and understanding the guild and knowing what it does, coming to this point in these books and reading this and having it affect me the way that it does, that the guild not only doesn't exist, but that the concept of creating the guild didn't even exist yet. It wasn't even something that anybody had considered until Jayan mentions it. And that's kind of bonkers, honestly. Like, it just seems like such a given to me that if there are a bunch of people and, you know, it's a bunch of people, but it's still a small percentage of the population all has literal supernatural abilities, you would think that getting together to learn from one another and train people who are inexperienced and share knowledge would be the order of the day. You would think that everybody would just have, like, organized and done that. And instead we're seeing just how secretive a lot of the magicians are and how they have, like, particular knowledge and advantages that other magicians do not have, because there has been a sort of assumption on my part that maybe there are one or two things that they do differently, but that for the most part, all of the magicians know the same magic. And as it turns out, that's not precisely true. There are certainly spells that they all... It's sort of funny because I say spells, but they don't really even call them spells, do they? But there are things that they all know how to do. For example, they all know how to create a shield. They all know how to summon, like, a ball of light. They all know how to, when they're playing that game later, they all know how to, like, send light strikes that don't actually do any damage. There are standard things that they all understand, but when it comes down to it, they all handle magic really differently. And depending on who taught them, were taught different tricks and secret ways of doing things that have not been shared outside of the family and the specific magician who trained them. And I guess it's sort of like, I think about it the way that you think about chefs, that like there's a certain amount of camaraderie amongst chefs in that we are all interested in the same thing. But when it comes down to it, sharing recipes is not really done unless it's established that this is like, I'm not going to be making a name for myself with this dish. Like, this isn't going to be something that's a signature of mine. Or it will be such a signature that I am not worried about it being distributed outside of my purview and control, because everybody will know that this was mine and my idea. So there's a certain amount of like, we share an interest, but there's still competition built in, you know? So that is interesting to me to see, because there are just so many things that I have a hard time, as somebody who is very practical most of the time. I have a hard time understanding the bowing to convention and tradition in the face of dire circumstances, when it would be much more efficient and practical to do something that is, you know, flouting convention. And they finally wind up kind of doing that. It's not even like because the flouting of convention that is proposed by Jayan is, can we bend the rules and have apprentices teaching one another? Because we are rapidly getting to a point where we don't have the power to protect ourselves, and the danger is growing more and more real. And it's kind of unfair for us to be out here as sitting ducks with no means of defending ourselves should something happen to the magicians. And they wind up like kind of agreeing with him, but they don't actually want to do what Jayan proposes. And in the end, it turns out that he's happier with what they suggest anyway. But initially I was like, come on, guys, because when he suggests we can teach each other, I'm like, yeah, what's the downside? Literally, I can't think of a single one. And they're still like, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. Because all of the magicians have this like expression on their face, and Dakin sees this, of being a little bit like alarmed at Jayan saying this and clearly not approving of it, even though it's literally turned into a life or death situation by that point. And it really pissed me off that they didn't just like out of the gate go, oh yeah, well, clearly we're going to need to break the rules because this is obviously an extenuating circumstance. They're still ready to just like follow the rules and protocol, despite the fact that everything has changed. And I just don't have a lot of respect for that. You know, it just, there is something to be said for the fact that, you know, protocols are put in place so that we can be more organized. That if the moment anything starts to go left, we drop all rules and protocols, then what is the point of them? And sure, that makes sense. But a lot of these protocols are put in place for long-term, like big picture sort of reasons, I would imagine. The rule about apprentices not teaching one another, I would think, is to keep, you know, to make sure that the best trained magicians are the ones that are spearheading everything, so that people aren't in danger of magicians who are like potentially out of control or not good at handling their own magic or being taught things incorrectly. But they are literally going to be surrounded by actual magicians for the duration. So having an apprentice teach other apprentices, to me, that danger that caused this rule to be put in place in the first place isn't relevant. And in the end, what they decide to do is like all of the magicians are going to take turns teaching them, which, I mean, it's fine. I'm glad that they come to a sort of agreement that still allows the apprentices to learn more and to be better prepared. But the fact that there was still an argument at all, I just can't understand, you know? It's just bananas to me that this is something we still need to worry about and argue about. And that theme sort of continues to come up in this section. And later on with Stara, the observance of convention and of ritual and of tradition is being addressed much more as like, this is ridiculous and silly and insulting, and I don't want to do this. But in those circumstances, I feel a lot more like, I feel a lot less rebellious, because at the start of her chapters, it's not a life and death situation. She's unhappy and feels stifled and essentially like kind of imprisoned because her father isn't seeing her. Nobody's like, she doesn't have anything to do. But it's not actually down to the fact that there's real danger here, you know? And so in her cases, I have a lot less like willingness for her to break rules, simply because I know that she doesn't fully understand the consequences of breaking those rules. In this case, though, it's the opposite, where they know the consequences, but the alternative is being sitting ducks. So, all right, so chapter 23, Dakin is really agitated as they continue to travel at seeing how bad the countryside is doing. And there's a line, people and land, they're the same, his father used to say. Neglect one and the other suffers eventually. And this is something that I think is important for us to understand even now. And we try and act like this is a lesson we've learned, and it's so not. Hi, global warming. And I just wish that we could like internalize this and really hear it, but we just don't ever seem to want to admit that we are dependent on this planet. It does not need us. We can be gone and it will be better off. And why don't we just like watch our back a little? But apparently we aren't capable of that. Fewer people had been killed or displaced than there would have been if the lowlands had been invaded, and there were few fields to be left unplanted. Even so, he wished he was in the lowlands, ensuring those driven from their homes were being given food and shelter in the southern villages, and that resources were not being wasted. But he also knew his time was better spent dealing with the invaders. The sooner he and his colleagues drove the Sachakans out, the sooner people could return to their homes. He was not the only magician frustrated by their failure to do that. An understanding had grown between them as the weeks had crawled past. All were annoyed by their situation, all tempted by the knowledge that change could be forced if they were willing to take risks. I highlighted this part. None complained, though, because none wanted to urge anyone else to endanger his life. All were waiting and hoping for some benign influence to shift the balance of power, hopefully in their favor and not the Sachakans. Now, this is one of those instances where I'm not exactly sure where the author stands, but this reads as incredibly cowardly to me. Like, they are all just sitting around hoping that something circumstantial happens to give them an advantage. And it's framed as none of them wanted to risk their friends' lives. And I'm like, I get that, but dude, like, lots of people have died already. And the fact that y'all are still hanging back like this is just so frustrating to me. And granted, they have a lot fewer in like magicians, and their magicians are not as powerful. So to a point, it's just a conservation of those who have power and abilities and are going to be valuable in defending the country. So sure. But also, like, holy shit, this is what you're here for, right? You have to take risks. There's something so passive and frustrating about that. So Hacken, Magician Hacken, and let's see, Lord Terrakin, Magician Genfell, they wind up showing up with their apprentices, and Dakin is sort of weirded out by it because these guys didn't really support the whole idea of the Circle of Friends. They weren't exactly on board with this idea. And the fact that they are joining up with them now, he's not exactly sure what kind of support they're going to offer. And indeed, Hacken is not understanding the situation very well. He wants to take control of it, and he wants to be the one in charge. But he doesn't know the terrain of the area. So he's making these like assumptions and judgment calls about how far they can go, how far the Sachakans can go, and where they can hide and all of this, when in fact it's not correct. And and he would know that if he was more aware of the area. And he's also making assumptions about how much they can stand up to Sachakin magicians. And it's clearly based in pride. You know, like, it's not like he seems to really understand what the Sachakins are capable of. It's much more that he resents the idea that one of them has absolutely no chance against one of them. And this guy coming to his senses, but not until after one of his friends is killed, is the most arrogant white dude thing. Like, this is just a thing with people who have not ever been in the position of realizing they genuinely have no fucking idea what they're talking about. And they breeze on forward with the complete confidence and surety of knowing it all. And this sort of person, unfortunately, requires a slap across the face of this magnitude to wake up. And I say unfortunately because it usually means that they require the sacrifice of another person in order to open their eyes. And this is, one could argue, kind of what's going on in our country right now. Like, we all sort of assumed that we were on the same page as a country in terms of wanting to stop all kinds of inequities and oppression, and then came to find out, because of a tragedy with an election, that we are not only not on the same page, but there are people out there actively interested in the opposite of what we all thought we wanted, and willing to sacrifice everyone, or at least half of us, for the sake of this, like, vague goal. So this sort of person, it just tries my patience so bad, because they are a danger to everyone around them, and they won't realize their mistake until shit has already gone down and is so dangerous that, like, there's no turning back at this point. And he just makes me really irritated. So they're talking about tracking these Sachakins, and the fact that the Sachakins are totally aware that the magicians are on their tail because they've killed scouts and stuff like this. Like, it's obvious that there's no secret here. And they're figuring out whether or not the Sachakins that they have spotted are even the same ones, because, like, various scouts who have managed to come back all sort of report different appearance, like people of different appearance and different numbers, different ratios of men to women. It's clear, the longer they go on, that there's more than one group of Sachakins, and that this potentially could be a much bigger problem than they really want to admit it is. They kind of thought that it was like a rogue group, and it might have started that way, but now it looks like they're being met up with by others, and they're just all sort of like, fuck. And Hacken and Olarin are both trying to say that they should draw out the magicians and trick them into making a mistake by, like, herding them in a certain direction and trapping them. And of course, the other magicians have already talked this over. Like, it's not like this hasn't occurred to them. It's a very basic idea. But the disadvantages of the variety of ways that they could do this are such that it's almost insurmountable. Herding them requires us to split into smaller, more vulnerable groups. We would have to communicate using mental calls, which they can definitely hear. And plus, somebody would have to volunteer to be the actual bait. And there's all of this, like, just the kind of thing that happens when you've been working on a project and somebody's, like, just swoops in and they make all of the suggestions that are, like, the most obvious, with this sort of attitude that you never occurred, like, this never occurred to you before, like you're too stupid to have thought of the most basic shit imaginable. It's just straight up insulting. It is. You know, if you're somebody who's, like, decent at your job and you're running into a roadblock, and a person assumes that you're running into that roadblock because you lack basic skills and knowledge, and not because maybe that roadblock is really difficult, it just feels like they have no faith in you, and it's just insulting. And what winds up happening is that they decide to risk somebody and that person winds up dead. So they're talking about like whether or not they want to kill the Sachakans, and Warren is like, no, we want to capture them and release them at the border. And rightfully, they're like, okay, so we release them at the border, then what? They just turn around and come right back inside. And Warren says, well, we'd actually have to guard the border, which again, more manpower, more magicians that they don't have. And as this conversation's going on, Dakin is looking over at Tessia and realizing that like all these magicians have shown up on top of the ones that were here. They've all brought their apprentices, and yet there are still no other women, and there are no other like lower class. So she's really, really isolated, and he's starting to grow a little bit concerned, and it's just kind of like, I hope she's doing okay, because I could see this being really tough on her. And he's also admiring the fact that she has managed to like put her grief aside and do what she needs to do for this group and getting along with Jayan, despite the fact that she's just like lost her entire family. And he thinks about the fact that there are a lot of other women that might be in like the wealthier families and have magic, who in Tessia's position would not handle this shit as well. And that's certainly true. I mean, the thing about this, and it's not untrue, but there's an assumption here that like, if you're wealthy, that you're going to be extremely pampered and a brat, or unable to control yourself and soldier on during difficult situations. And this is especially applied towards women. And the thing is that as much as that may certainly be true in plenty of cases, even the most well-meaning people, if they grew up surrounded by wealth and never had to want for anything, they're just going to have a totally different perspective and understanding of the world. But also, there's a sort of discounting of the fact that women, no matter what status they occupy, have been expected to do things without complaint since birth, pretty much. And while they might not all manage that, the assumption that because they're higher class, they wouldn't be able to manage as well is not one that really sits right with me. I'm like, I bet there are plenty of women that would keep their mouths shut and keep their thoughts to themselves because they know that showing any amount of emotion would get them labeled as sort of hysterical, or, you know, potentially like their magic could get out of control, or who knows what. But, you know, this is the way it's one of those that I'm like unclear on whether or not the writer really believes this, or if Dakin is the only one that really believes this. But in any case, I do appreciate the fact that he's taking Tessia's situation into account, and that he's sort of like mentally checking in on her here and there and realizing that maybe he should talk to her more often about her situation and get a better like assessment of how she's doing, because he really doesn't know. And we jump from there to Stara, who is I can't remember her father's name, because the one that's in charge of Hanara is Takedo, I think. And her father's name is really similar, but I don't know it. But she is really frustrated with the fact that she isn't allowed to see her father when she wants. Like, he's her father. You would really think that out of everybody, he would be the person that she would have access to. But no, it's all according to when he wants to see her, and the slaves are not willing to, like, bother him unless he summons her specifically. And at one point, she just decides to take matters into her own hands and like pushes past all of them to get into his rooms and demand that he talk to her, and he's not even there. So she's just really, really isolated. The one thing that she's kind of enjoying is the fact that Sachakan women's clothing is always really beautiful. It's a lot more revealing in the way that the clothing falls, even though the urging of modesty is much higher here in a lot of ways regarding social interactions. The clothing is much less modest, which is really interesting. And there's a lot of like really beautiful jewelry and brightly, the clothing is brightly colored. And just overall, she's kind of having a good time with this. And it turns out that she's being dressed for the dinner at which she's going to see the man for the first time that her father wants her to marry. And this goes better than I expected. I kind of thought it was going to be like this sort of confrontational moment. I even wondered if she was going to purposely try and embarrass her father or do something equally stupid. And instead, she tries as best she can to comport herself the way she's expected to, despite the fact that it galls her to like not be allowed to speak or make eye contact or whatever. But she clearly zeroed in on the wrong dude, because there are 3 guys there, I think. And let's see, I'm trying to find the spot where she sees, okay. The other seats had been arranged around it and were occupied. 2 men in richly decorated jackets sat to one side. On the other sat another stranger in less colorful clothes and with no knife, and a man she recognized. As she realized who he was, she felt her stomach sink. As if sensing her dismay, her brother looked up at her and frowned. So she's not excited to see her brother, and it's interesting because Vora, a little bit later, kind of vouches for him a little bit and suggests that he's changed and that maybe she should try talking to him again because it's going to be different this time. Super duper curious about that. And I wish very much that Starra took up Vora on this offer to see him, but she's pretty much cemented in that she doesn't want to see him and that he's probably the same dude. But yeah, so this meeting, she thinks the guy that's younger is the one that her father's thinking of marrying her off to. But it turns out that it's the older one, and she doesn't find that out until a little bit later. Vora, meanwhile, is getting rather impatient with Starra's attempts constantly to flout convention. And it's not even really so much that it seems Vora is scandalized by what she's doing. It's not like Vora is personally offended by the action she's trying to take. It seems much more that Vora understands what's at stake and the potential consequences better than Starra does, and is trying to protect her and direct her in such a way that she can like be more free by obeying these specific rules and then getting away with other things in a different way later. And frankly, I think that it takes too long for Starra to realize that Vora is on her side. Like, she is attempting to feel out, I guess, exactly what Starra is capable of and willing to do. And there's a conversation later that we'll get to that I was just like, whoa, that escalated really quickly. But yeah, so Starra's just really bored. They're listening to all of this. She's listening to this conversation about politics and isn't really super interested. She was hoping that it would be about trade, but politics does affect trade, so she tries to pay attention. And she thinks that when the older man says something like Kakato, let us not presume to know what the emperor would or wouldn't do. She's like, oh, okay, he called the younger man Kakato. Of course that younger man has to be the one I might marry. I'm going to remember his name. And it turns out that she was wrong about this. And she says, Master Kakato's father, Master Tokacha. And when Vora tells her, like, that's the guy, she's like, why didn't you warn me? To which Vora is like, you didn't ask. And to do any more than ordered is to disobey. To which Starra is like, can you just make an agreement with me that you will tell me shit that's important? Like, everything. And Vora tells her, your brother is a kind man and talented, but like you, a slave. And there's an interesting conversation earlier where Vora is explaining to her that everybody is a slave, even her father, in a way, because, part of the reason that him and his wife split up is because he felt he had to behave a certain way in Sachakan society, and she didn't like to see that. And he didn't feel like that was optional. He didn't think like, oh, I'm sorry, I behaved in a way that upset you. Let me just go back and act like you, the guy that you know. No, that's not an option. This is a place in which you have to get by and survive. And in order to do that, you have to behave in a really cruel way a lot of the time. And so to a degree, it seems like Sarah understands what she means. And of course, there's different levels within that. There is the kind of pain, despite being a slave in one way, that you can still inflict on other people. And that gives you a certain power, despite the fact that you might be held to certain standards. So I'm not sure that I totally buy this, but I get what she's going for here. And there's just that the relationship between Vora and Stara is interesting, because Stara clearly doesn't appreciate how invested Vora is, and allegedly Vora is the one who raised her when she was a baby, but she doesn't really remember her. And I'm wondering how much Vora remembers, and if that's part of the reason that she is already getting involved like this, because she has a personal, not even nostalgia, but just affection for this girl that she raised for a little while. So in the morning, Tessia sees that there is a bit of a commotion. And she goes over to Giant asking what happened, and he says that Lord Sudan left and took Aiken with him. And nobody's sure why, but Aiken admits that he and Lord Sudan discuss strategies for luring Sachakans into revealing themselves, or possibly scouting for themselves. He thinks Sudan might have left to try out one of his own ideas. And I'll talk about the full implications of this in a minute, but Mikken comes up right here and starts chatting and smiles at her. And she thinks to herself, you know what, this guy's actually pretty cute. And she turns back around, and Giant is scowling. And she thinks that he's scowling because he doesn't approve of what this magician did. But it's so clear as a reader that he's scowling because he doesn't like Mikken talking to her, and he's jealous. It's unclear whether he's jealous because he could see on her face that she was ooh, Mikken, actually, you're kind of hot. Or if it's just Mikken's presence and that alone that made him go, fucking guy, can you not for a second? But regardless, I enjoy the fact that she doesn't seem to understand why Giant has that expression on his face, because her assumption makes total sense. Except for the fact he saw that she was looking at him and his expression became abruptly neutral, which that really doesn't make sense. If all he's upset about is a magician's actions, why would he need to be neutral in front of her and pretend that he doesn't care? But it has not even occurred to her that Giant is interested, because she thinks that he just looks down on her still. And they wind up packing up really quickly to try and head up after Sudan. And things are really tense, because everybody's just sort of disgusted at the fact that this guy would just take it upon himself to do something this risky. And the magicians are getting into it. Their discussion is more heated. Whatever the conflict was, she was not surprised to learn it might have led to Sudan's leaving the group. Soon it became clear that the tracks of Sudan's and Aiken's horses weren't heading south. They were heading northeast away from the city. Confrontation might not be Sudan's plan, though. He might have decided to scout for himself. Perhaps make his way to the pass from which no scouts had returned, or maybe he intended to find a high place from which he might spot the Sachakans, then guide the rest of the group with mental instructions. It would be risky, as the Sachakans would hear the same communications and no doubt send someone to stop him. So they're thinking this, of all of the potential, what's the word I want? Drawbacks of what this guy is doing. They're following the tracks and winding up going off path or not off path, but like they're not heading in the direction that they would be otherwise. So they're having to waste time following this guy. And the areas that they're going into are very steep and really a little bit more dangerous and a little bit more exposed. Generally, this guy is risking everybody because of the decision that he made. And then all of a sudden, a mental call comes from Lord Sudan to Lord Warren. And there's mental, like, help, and then too late, and screams. And then all of a sudden there's a scream, and it's like a scream out loud. Like they realize that they are hearing that scream, not in their heads through mental communication, but out coming from the forest. And a couple of these magicians head out. There's like an impression of blood in the mental communications. And when the magicians come back, they are really somber. And we find out that like the Sachakans not only killed these two magicians, but tortured and dismembered them and really went over the top with it. And this is a moment that's really tough for me to read. Jayan, like, they don't share the details of the fact that these guys were cut into pieces. Jayan kind of presses Mikan to find out exactly what the deal was, and Mikan tells him. And kind of also is like, and please don't tell Tessia, because he thinks that she's a delicate lady and can't handle that kind of information. But once Mikan tells Jayan this, we get a paragraph. Whenever Jayan thought about what Mikan had told him, he felt cold right down to his bones. He realized that for most of his life, he'd imagined the Sachakan magicians as being not so different from Kiralians. They kept slaves instead of lording it over commoners. They maintained land and trade as Kiralian lords did. He reasoned that these invaders were merely bored young men with high ambitions, of which there were plenty in Kiralia, though none held ambitions as high as conquering another land. But now Jayan knew better. Now he knew they were savages. No ambitious young Kiralian magician would have killed with such deliberate, undeserved cruelty. Not unless he was dealing out revenge for a truly atrocious act, and even then, Jayan had to acknowledge that if anyone he'd known had shown he was capable of such savagery, he would have regarded them with disgust and wariness from then on. What the Sachakans had done to Sudan and Akin took planning and practice. That's what angered and frightened Jayan the most. So, do you guys know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say, I've been giving these books a bit of a side eye for this like kind of fantasy racism that a lot of fantasy is guilty of. And this section really disappointed me. I am not totally sure whether or not Jayan is supposed to be representative of what the author believes as she's writing this. Like, does she think that this is absolutely true and she's explaining us what we need to understand about Sachakans? Or is she just telling us what Jayan thinks and believes? I think it's the former. I think it's both. Jayan thinks and believes this because the author wants us to think and believe this. And the thing that's so frustrating here is that when you get into more of Stara's chapters, there is a clear parallel between the culture, both in dress, food, and overall customs, as well as attitude towards women, of vaguely Middle Eastern countries, right? And the fact that the author has decided to borrow so much about the attitudes, for example, the fact that Stara is not really like allowed to have men in the house with her if there isn't anybody else home except for slaves, that if she goes to market, there is meant to be somebody who is male and related to her, like her brother would be the ideal to be with her. Like she can have a male family member, but not a male, suitor or anything near her without supervision. There are a lot of things that ring familiar. And I feel like the author deciding to make T'Chaka the bad guys, like in this way that's almost cartoonish at this point, and also have them to have a culture that is similar to Middle Eastern cultures in our world, and to be darker skinned as well. It just feels like she decided to take a bias that I feel she has towards people in the Middle East in general and put that into her story. And I could be reading way too much into this, but I have been sort of like, from the first trilogy, feeling weird about it. And this couple of paragraphs for me really put me over the edge of just being like, wow, straight up, they're just savages and they're all like this. And that's really what's being suggested. Even with Stara's father, you know, it's allegedly that he's like a kinder, better person when he's not in T'Chaka. But what we see of him and his willingness to invade his daughter's mind later, that is not the action of a person who is interested in being better. This is not a person who is like, you know, unwilling to do in private the things that he must do in public. He behaves, in my opinion, as his true self, and her mother simply misunderstood him and believed him to be better, and maybe he was for a bit, and kind of came back to himself once he returned to T'Chaka, and she wasn't ready for it and didn't like it. There is very little to me that points to this author having any sort of nuance in the way that she's choosing to portray these people. There isn't even Hanara, whom I thought she was going to try and be like, give us somebody who's a little bit more sympathetic. And he is slightly. Hanara is still a victim who grew up in this culture and is still going to have like, he has his master's back and he still believes in certain rituals and customs. And even when we're in Hanara's perspective, he's like looking at Tessia at one point and thinking about how she seemed so good and pure and kind, unlike anybody in T'Chaka. Literally were the words. There was nobody he had ever met in T'Chaka that was like her. I can't with this, guys. This really grosses me out. And it's something that I feel like these books could have been ripe for making into movies. They're very like, they have a pretty simple storyline most of the time too. So you could do it pretty easily without having to change or leave out too much. But this would have to be altered, because there's no way that you do this on screen and this doesn't come across as wildly offensive. It's similar to me as the depictions of the Calormans in the Chronicles of Narnia books. Except even amongst the Calormans, there are those who are like silly, but not like vicious and dangerous. And if I'm comparing this to the Calormans, and the Calormans come out looking better than the T'Chakans, that's pretty egregious. That's like really quite over the top. And I just can't get past the constant dichotomy and black and white comparison of like, well, the Karelians never, like no Karelian young men had aspirations to conquer lands. Like, let's be honest here. Sure, there are certain countries that treat their women poorly. Guess what? The U.S. is certainly one of them, whether you think that or not. It's true. And also the idea that the white European style country in this universe doesn't have power-hungry colonialist men who would like to conquer other lands is laughable. Like, maybe Giant doesn't think these guys exist, but the idea that they really don't, that we're supposed to believe that they really don't, and be on his side with this, is nonsense. people are people, no matter what country you come from. If there are power-hungry people in your culture, there are power-hungry people in the other. And this attitude that he has, that I really get the impression we are supposed to take on faith and believe, that these attitudes simply don't exist among Kiralians the way they do among Sechakans, is garbage. I just can't. Like, that just... This flavored the rest of everything that I read in this section and is going to taint the rest of the book. And I know it. So I just want to be really upfront with you guys and share that this is something that I find extremely offensive. And like, this author has been dancing around this for a minute, and I have tried so hard to give her the benefit of the doubt that she's going to like pull it out later on, that there's somebody who's like not awful from this country, or that there are customs that are like actually make more sense and are better. But it seems like the only thing that she can do is have this speech from Vora about like, aren't we all really kind of slaves in our own way? And to a degree, sure, but there's not anything like an equal power structure despite that. And otherwise, she has done nothing but double down on this attitude. So I'm just really, I understand that we have seen plenty of Kiralians who are more, what's the word? They're more selfish, right? So it's not like the Kiralians are all saints or anything. Like, Dakin is notable to Tessia for being one of the guys who is like, what's the word? He cares about his people and is willing to sacrifice himself on their behalf, in a way that a lot of the other lords that she's come across are clearly not. And they dismiss the commoners and their plight very easily. So I'm not trying to say that she's making the Kiralians like perfect at all. But I am saying that she's having the Kiralians seem to, as a group, have like a slightly elevated understanding of the world as compared to Sechakans. And the one exception that I see on the horizon, maybe, is Stara's brother. And at this point, after all this, I'm kind of like worried that he's not going to be enough, that he's going to be like the one guy. And after everything that has been said and done, it's not going to feel like it matters anymore. Like, it's just going to be too late for me. 'Cause that can happen. I'll have a problem with something and it'll seem like a book or a TV show, like writers realize their mistake and try to rectify that. And sometimes it works, but sometimes it's just too little too late. And you know, there is something to be said to have like one person out of an entire country, even just the one, almost will underline the issue rather than prove that the issue isn't there, you know, like, so I don't know, we'll see, but this is something that I am feeling a way about. And I needed to be honest about that. And Martin says, guess you'll have to keep reading and find out, which makes me feel like he's promising that there is something that's going to be better and change in the future. So fingers crossed. But like I said, I'm not going to promise any of you that if things get better or change that I'm going to buy it. So be ready for me to just be mad about this. And I hope that you are prepared. So anyway, this thing that happens with this magician is what kind of leads to Haken really stepping back and admitting that he does not know what's going on, that he doesn't know the terrain. He doesn't really even know where the borders are. He doesn't understand what they're up against at all. And it took the death of a colleague for him to really like come to terms with the fact that he isn't fucking omniscient, and bows to their judgment a couple of times in instances where they clearly expected him to put up a fight. And the fact that the Sechakans have killed a magician changes everything, because up until now they had killed commoners. And I've said this already, the fact that, like, I understand, diplomatically speaking, if you don't kill somebody who's super important, that you are not declaring war. But I also feel that letting them come up in here and kill a bunch of commoners especially it wasn't just one town. They've gone across the countryside and screwed up a bunch of lays and forced people to evacuate and wreaked havoc on the harvest, because it's springtime. So there's supposed to be a lot of planting happening right now, breeding of animals, and all of this is being fucked up by these guys. To me, treating this as not an act of war is weak. I think that this is something that it's really sad that the Karelians don't have any means of defending themselves here that seems to be actually effective. Because there's like the constant, well, if we do this, it's declaring war, and we don't know that we'll win. And when I thought about it, I realized that I had, that there was a bit of a blank spot in this world in terms of magical defenses that actually mean anything. And by that, I mean, like, I believe that there was like magic placed on one of the gates leading out into the desert, if I'm not mistaken, in the third book, when Sonia was cast out with Acheron. They had the Sechakans attacked that gate and like finally got through, but initially there was magic like that was placed on it as a defense. Don't you think it's kind of bonkers that they don't have more magicians and yet they don't put anything in place to sort of like magically defend the borders more effectively? I just feel like there are, if you know you don't have enough to defend your country, you figure out a way to make their abilities spread out and remain somewhere more permanently. And the king, I mean, he understands that like these magicians aren't exactly united, but if he gives them an order to do what they can to protect borders, I feel like their instinct would be to try and outdo one another with the most effective spells and barriers and protections that they can come up with. And that's what you want, right? So it's kind of bananas to me that there has been this worry about Sechaka like hovering for a while, but there doesn't seem to be any magical barriers in place at all. And they seem to be acting as if there are only magicians, like one, like the actual presence of a human magician has to be what stops them. And I'm not trying to say that these barriers would really like withstand a barrage of attack and they wouldn't eventually get through, but just having that as a deterrent would be good and would feel like they were, and practicing that together, I feel like they would begin to develop better defensive magic and be able to do more in that respect. And I just, it's interesting because I've said this so many times that the books that I read are almost all fantasy and almost all have magical powers in them somehow. And the attitudes towards that magic by the authors are all very, very different. And something like Lyriel, which I'm reading now, they have literal magically like imbued stone that it's impossible to destroy, or charter sendings, which are basically magically formed like fake people that perform certain tasks or illusions or whatever. And in this world, magic feels a whole lot more limited, way more. And it's like, it's a nice thing to have, but it's also not exactly like changing the world. And I would like a little bit more investigation in just how far they can push things and how much knowledge they haven't even tapped into yet in this regard, because it doesn't seem like they've put a whole lot of effort into like defensive strategies, architecturally speaking, in ways that they don't need to personally man with a magician. Martin says, I don't know how to put this, but in a few comments, I think you're overestimating how much magicians there are in the country. They aren't a resource that can be wasted lightly. Another thing is, I don't think there no mention of permanent magic in any of the books. It always has to be actively used. Yeah, so I would like that to be addressed. Because I don't remember it being mentioned specifically or not, if you can enchant an object. And I don't think that's in these books. But if it's not, I want it to be mentioned. And even if it's not, there's no, like, ability to create at least a physical barrier, like a wall. Listen, I'm saying build the wall is what I'm saying. But seriously, like, this is an area that's very vulnerable. Where's the regular army? Like, not that they would really stand up against the Chakans, but you'd think that their presence would exist at all. Does the king not just have actual human forces? I just don't really, like, understand the way that this works in this world. Martin says, how would you make a physical barrier that wouldn't limit trade? I mean, they're all coming in on certain roads. It's not like people are just coming over the border wherever. And if you were going to be having a civilization with, like, trade that's regulated, they shouldn't be coming in wherever. You should be having, like, a checks and balances system to make sure that the people who are coming in have what they say they have and are leaving with what they say they are leaving with. Like, that for me would make trade more organized and safe. But, you know, like I said, I don't really know what the deal is with this country and its military or any defensive strategy at all. It's like, it feels like they're newborns, you know, they seem just really innocent and unprepared in a way that's frustrating. But anyway, so they wind up sort of, I mentioned already, deciding that they're going to have the magicians teaching and helping the apprentices get their magic to be a little more honed. And then we have the confrontation with Stara and her father. Martin says, but to have that work as a military defense, it would have to be enforced as magicians. Would it? I mean, you could have some magicians assigned and rotating in and out. You don't need to have a constant. And just having a military presence, like, sure, they probably would not withstand a magical attack. Like, but there comes a point where I don't, like, put some effort of any kind in. Like, sure, there might be drawbacks to this and that, but, like, it feels like they haven't even thought this through. And I guess that's the part that's frustrating to me is, like, you and I are over here talking about the pros and cons of this, but the author hasn't mentioned any of it. And that's what I want, is for her to address it and make me feel as a reader that the rulers of this world have thought of this and have good reasons for not doing it. And I mean, you know, quite apart from there being like a magical assault, there could be just a regular military assault that they need to rebuff. Like, who knows? Not everybody even has magic. They could be worried about more than T'Chaka. They could be worried about Eileen as well. But whatever. So Stara, she goes out to the market without her father's permission, and Vora is very worried about it. She meets a guy that she thinks is pretty good looking, and he offers to take her home in his wagon because she doesn't have a male escort. And when she gets home, her father is extremely agitated at the fact that this guy, like, made overtures and she didn't rebuff him. He wants to know what she told the guy because he seems like worried that she gave up some sort of trade secret. And her father grabs her hands and starts to forcibly read her mind and starts to look into things beyond the deal with this guy and whether or not she has slept with a man, whether or not she has been pregnant, really private shit that, of course, he feels he has every right to know as her father and the one that's going to be, like, marrying her off, selling her, essentially. And she has to magically rebuff him. And he didn't even know she had magic. So this comes as an unpleasant surprise to him that she's been keeping this secret. And the fact that she has slept with other men, which we had found out from her perspective earlier, renders her, as he puts it, valueless. She's not a virgin, and she just, you know, there's no way that she's worth anything now. And it's super disgusting. And she, for her part, this has, like, completely broken her heart. she has been trying this whole time to get her father's respect, and to have him just completely violate her like this, it's a kind of a rape, is unforgivable. And he has no apologies about this at all. He feels that this is 100% in his purview to know and do. And she is feeling like she doesn't know what to do and is talking to Vora about it later. And Vora asks her if she knows how to kill a man while bedding him. To which Star is like, excuse me? And that's kind of the end of the chapter, is just her sitting there like, why did she ask me that? And I also want to know, Vora, what's your deal? Who are you? What's going on here? But yeah, I'm super duper curious. Like, I really love the direction that that's going. And I wonder if Vora has magic and is sort of like keeping that on the DL. But I feel like Stara's brother is going to have to play into this eventually. So we'll see. But I'm out of time, so I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you to Martin for being in the chat and chit-chatting with me about this. And thank you, Ashleigh, for commissioning this. I'm really curious and worried about what's coming. We shall see. But, you know, I said what I said, so I guess we'll find out. But thank you guys all so much again. And I will be seeing you soon with a new episode. So until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.